This episode of Trifles is brought to you by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Boscombe Valley was mysterious, Shoscombe Place was old, and the lodge was hysterical, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Was Holmes more of a tea drinker or a coffee fancier? And what are all of the alcoholic drinks mentioned in the stories?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 441, About the Moor. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you out and about on the moor?
More or less, yeah.
Les Moore, he was one of my favorite college chums.
I always liked Dinty.
He was an oxymoron. Oxymoron. Boy, we're stretching here. This is, it's a special episode for us because it is a listener-requested topic. We always tell you that if you would like us to discuss something related to the Sherlock Holmes story, something that you might need clarification on, something that you might have been confused by, or maybe something that you think we should have covered by now that we haven't, then please let us know. That's done simply by sending us an email. You can email us at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com with your request. And in this case, and I should say, every time we get a request and we use it on the air, that person gets a prize from the Trifles vaults. So we do have a prize set up this time for Nelson Pigeon. Hooray. Nelson wrote in to ask us specifically about the Moor in the Hound of the Baskervilles. He said he'd like to hear more about the Moor. What's it really like? Does the Rathbone Hound portray an accurate picture? Is the Grimpen Mire a real thing? Well, Nelson and everyone else, we have answers to these questions and more straight ahead on this episode of Trifles. Meanwhile, if you'd like to support the show, we welcome any and all contributions. For as little as $1 a month, you can show your support of Trifles, which means that it helps us fund the research, the hosting costs, everything that goes into producing a fine quality show that you have come to appreciate. Simply go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com to pick your preferred platform for regular and bonus content. All of our supporters do have an opportunity not only to be entered for a drawing every month for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal, but our paid supporters also have the opportunity to listen to bonus content. So sign up at the platform of your choice. Well, Bert, when we were approached by Nelson to learn more about the Moor, this isn't one of those topics that we can necessarily just pop off on and do our usual casual banter. We actually had to do some real work for this one, didn't we?
Yeah, I had to walk, oh boy, I don't know, it may have been 4 or 5 feet over to my bookshelf. And And not only that, this was a book, that was not just at eye level. I think I had to reach up probably about 6 inches.
Oh, my God. Do you need a minute?
Yeah. Ooh. Well, my heart rate, I think, has settled down. But it turns out that both Scott and I have a copy of Philip Weller's 2001 book, The Hound of the Baskervilles, Hunting the Dartmoor Legend. And this was produced by Philip in connection with the 100th anniversary of the appearance of the case of the Hound of the Baskervilles in the Strand magazine. And it really should have been titled The Hound of the Baskervilles File, because Philip Weller has put in just about every bit of information and pictures and photographs and maps and things that could possibly be vacuumed up at the time about the hound and its locale.
Yeah, you noticed that too, did you? But it includes a lovely foreword by Edward Hardwick, none other than Dr. Watson himself from the Jeremy Brett Granada series. But more than that, there's background here that there's a few sections of the book, and by the way, it's a beautiful book. It's solid. I mean, it's heavy paper, heavy glossy paper that's been used. Lavishly illustrated with both period and modern photographs of locations on the moor. So from that perspective, it really helps bring some of this to life rather than just the Sidney Paget illustrations that we're also familiar with. But more importantly, Weller sets the stage for us with his preface. And he acknowledges that The Hound of the Baskervilles is without question the most influential work of fiction ever to have been written about Dartmoor. And he said there are millions of people around the world who've never visited Dartmoor, but who have a good impression of how the moor looks and feels from reading this wonderfully atmospheric book. The many hundreds of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts who make a pilgrimage to Dartmoor each year have not been disappointed by what they have read and then seen, with the book's references to the moor and its many mysteries and legends, the prisons, tors, stone huts, circles, and monuments, fog, ponies, rivers, and mires. Fortunately, these pilgrims have rarely encountered escaped prisoners, but there are those who felt that they've experienced the presence of a gigantic hound, such as the richness of the imagery in the book. And he leaves us with a quote from The Hound of the Baskervilles, which was said by none other than Stapleton. It is a wonderful place, the moor. You never tire of the moor. You cannot think of the wonderful secrets which it contains. It is so vast, so barren, and so mysterious.
Yeah, and that is really the point here, because, you have just framed up, and Stapleton and Philip Weller have framed up how the moor appears. It's described as this vast, barren, wild landscape. It's characterized by harsh weather, very desolate area. It's this atmosphere of mystery and dread. It's described as this sort of rolling expanse of wetlands. It's a place where nature isn't controlled or it's wild, it's untamed. And there's this whole atmosphere of dread and mystery and, this hint of the supernatural and the irrational. And it's sort of an unsettling environment. And, Sir Henry, when he goes out there, he starts to believe a little maybe in the family curse after being in the moor at night. And, it's a great place, and it's a great place for inquiry. And here in Weller's book, he begins by talking about and taking us to some real Houndian locations, because, of course, the investigation that he's done has taken him to the sources for the hound.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And Conan Doyle was always quite adept at this, pulling from the world he knew, whether it was a street setting in London, a train schedule, a trip out to Dartmoor, or even some of the people that he knew from real life. He was able to weave these together in such a way that there was a realism there. And we, in turn, were brought into this invented world, half invented, half real world. And the lines blur. And when you step into the location of Dartmoor, you can see a lot of the reality there. You know, there is another chapter called Invented Houndian Locations, but the real locations are the ones that really give us some inspiration. And, you know, he runs down a number of the names of places, Eastern White Barrow, Huntington Cross, Riders Hill, et cetera, et cetera. And we have to remember that the Moor is a place that was occupied by ancient people. And we'll get to that in another section of the book that we'll discuss as well. But there are still traces of these folks around and names that have been handed down generation over generation. So there's a lot of meaning there. And Weller has what he calls a reliability warning. There's clearly a great deal of room for debate between the merits of contending candidates for some of the invented locations. And sometimes it may only be a matter of personal choice as to which is seen as the best. And you know, here he refers to, you know, trying to match up the real and the invented. And Sherlockians and Holmesians for years, I think, have gone on these pilgrimages to try and identify a house or, a particular geographic location and match it up. And this is part of the wonderful pursuit of the Sherlockian world. You know, we talked about this a couple of episodes ago in looking at the backyards of Baker Street. So the same thing now is happening out in nature, as it were, out on Dartmoor, identifying some of these areas.
Yeah, and we should make clear to our listeners, and particularly to Nelson Pigeon, that what we're talking about is what is today encompassed by the Dartmoor National Park. And it is relatively small in scale. It occupies about 370 square miles. And, you know, we've just talked about some of the locations. But when Watson refers to the Moor, we can generally accept this as being the geographical area bounded by the limits of the ancient forest of Dartmoor, existing primarily in the western two-thirds of the Dartmoor National Park. And this is the area that's been referred to, particularly in Weller's book, as the Moor, with the larger area of the Dartmoor National Park being referred to as Dartmoor. So that's the context. And in this context, this word forest, the ancient forest of Dartmoor, has nothing to do with trees. It was a technical term for an area of land where hunting was solely the privilege of the monarch. And this ancient forest area was bounded by certain set points, and though there's some minor disagreement over the identity of all these points, they sort of run in an anti-clockwise direction from the most southerly point. And then Weller, goes into all of this stuff. But basically, what he's laid out in his book is the area surrounded by the forest boundary, which lies to the south of a line drawn from a point slightly north of Dartmeet to North Hessery Tor. And when Watson talks about traveling along the edge of the moor, he's referring to the roads which ran around the southeastern part of the ancient forest. So that's sort of the critical area, cut off from the rest of Dartmoor. So you're looking, sort of at a specific section within this larger view.
And within that location, within that geographical boundary, we see, and he's got some wonderful modern photographs here of actual locations. For example, Dead Man's Bottom, near Plym Steps. It's a candidate for the Goyal, where the wicked Hugo Baskerville met the original Hound. and it's a small valley where there's a little creek at the bottom of a little stream, and it looks like a place where someone might be run down and trapped, as if by the Hound. There's Black Tor and Shipley Tor, and those are both mentioned in the story. We have the Bronze Age enclosure of Grimspound, where there were 24 stone hut circles. And Grimspound, or Grimspan, as it's pronounced on Dartmoor, may well have influenced the name of Grimpen, which we know as associated with the great Grimpen Mire. And there's the tin works at Head. A lot of these relics of, as I said, the people who inhabited the moor thousands of years ago, that Holmes witnessed, and of course that Conan Doyle brought to life, very much can be seen in their real placements, their real existence, if you visit Dartmoor.
And of course, the Grimpen Mire, the great Grimpen Mire, is a central place in the story, particularly because of the menace and the supernatural and the untamed nature of it. Weller points out that there is no such mire on the moor, although there are many boggy places on the moor which are named as mires, but there are very few places that fit the true meaning of the word. Land drainage associated with agriculture and with providing water for Plymouth accounted for the drying up of many of the mires on the moat during the 19th century. And those, unfortunately, which Weller talks about, remain nowhere near as dangerous as the description of the Great Grimpen Mire suggests. In fact, he writes, it's almost impossible for a man to be sucked down completely beneath the surface anywhere on the moor, which is not to say you can't sink into one of the very small and isolated bog holes on the moor, but these are mostly filled with water, and if one falls in, one can fairly easily get out again. And which is not to suggest that you can't get stuck, as the Mormons say in mire, but it's hello muck, hello mire, but it is extremely difficult to sink more than waist deep in these places. And you tend to get plenty of warning that this is liable to happen. It can, he says, be almost impossible to get out unaided. And you can easily die of exposure if you're stuck in such a position on the moor in bad weather for even just a few hours. But the truly great mires on the moor can be reduced to only a handful. And he talks about the great mire on the northern moor, which might seem to be very attractive, as being the original of the great Grimpen Mire. But the pool nature, he says, of the name of this mire is indicative of it being different than most of the other great mires on the moor. This is the Rainbow Pool and other great North Moor mires. So it's... well, and then there are issues about where are the locations here, but and whether or not these particular places are watery or not. But clearly, Grimpen Mire and the actual locations here are no place for a summer holiday.
Yeah, and he goes on to mention Grimspan Bog, the obvious name association with the word Grimpen, has been claimed to have been the inspiration for the great Grimpen Mire in scores of articles and books. The main influence here seems to be Baring Gould. And we should mention that William S. Baring Gould, who of course famously authored the annotated Sherlock Holmes, had a grandfather, Sabine Baring Gould, who actually wrote a book about Dartmoor. And as Weller says, the main influence here of blaming A Grimspen bog as the inspiration for Grimpen Mire seems to be bearing gold. But once again, it's not Sabine, but his American grandson who's at fault, with no less authority than the Oxford English Dictionary, quoting him. Oh, goodness. And defining the only English word which it accepts as being invented by ACD, Grimpen. As it's well known, Watson, the Great Grimpen Mire is Grimspen Bog, 3 miles north and west of Widecombe in the Moor. It should firstly be noted, Weller says, that a bog is technically not quite the same thing as a mire, although the differences are truly minor, and ACD does refer to part of the Great Grimpen Mire as being a bog. But the several major problems with Grimspen Bog, with the first and most important being the fact that it does not exist, is indicated by the quotation marks which are assigned to it here. There's a slightly boggy area surrounding the Grimslake stream, upstream of the Grimspen enclosure, but it would be difficult to get one's calves wet in that small area. So again, it's, a lot of these little influences, and I think whether you think about something like the Great Grimpen Mire or, say, the Florida Everglades, it's the vastness of these locations that seems to overwhelm we tiny humans. When you consider, tramping through the mire and getting your calves wet, or perhaps being in a tropical setting in the Florida Everglades, well, that's fine in a limited setting. But when you think of the vastness of the place, I think there's a type of phobia of vast places. It's not agoraphobia, but there is a phobia that people have of just being overwhelmed by the vastness of some of these instances.
Yeah, and Weller is very fond of all of these different locations. Fox Tor Mires, which he goes into in great detail. He points out that the Great Grimpen Mire is described in the story as having the remains of an old tin mine within its boundaries, and there are the remains of an old tin mine workings, not only all around Fox Tor Mires, but within it, including the remains of the water wheel, which is in the Great Grimpen Mire mine workings. So, he's pretty fond about that. But another major geographical feature of the environment out on the moor are the graves and these huge monoliths.
Yeah, this is mentioned in, which chapter was mentioned in? Chapter, was it 8?
I think there's a couple of references, particularly around the monoliths and the stones, close to the time they arrive.
164 here. Let's see. That is... Yeah, the first report of Dr. Watson in Chapter 8. Watson mentions when you're once out upon its bosom, you have left all traces of modern England behind you. But on the other hand, you are conscious everywhere of the homes and the work of the prehistoric people. On all sides, as you walk, are the houses of these forgotten folk with their graves and the huge monoliths which are supposed to have marked their temples. As you look at their gray stone huts against the scarred hillsides, you leave your own age behind you, as if you were to see a skin-clad, hairy man crawl out of one of the low doors, fitting in a flint-tipped arrow to the string of his bow. You'd feel that his very presence there was more natural than your own. The strange thing that they should have lived so thickly on what must have always been most unfruitful soil. I'm no antiquarian, but I could imagine that they were some very unwarlike and harried race who were forced to accept that which none other would occupy.
And Weller points out in his book here that there are many different types of prehistoric grave on the moor, with the smallest being these rectangular box-shaped coffins made of 6 slabs of stone, usually being around 2 feet in width, 3 feet in length, and 2 feet in depth, which indicates that they probably did not contain whole bodies but ashes, and tombs were often used more than once. Larger remains exist within those graves, which were covered with stones and earth, which form barrows as large mounds. But the biggest graves are the few Neolithic tombs, which can be large chambered tombs comprising enormous slabs of rock to form the walls, floor, and roof, with the covering of small stones and earth, often having been removed in recent centuries. Tombs were sometimes surrounded by a circle or circles with up to 4 concentric rings of stones. And there are often avenues of stones that lead to the tombs, and these sometimes end with an extra large column of stone known as a monolith, although monoliths also exist in splendid isolation on the moor. And so, these details, these graves, these huge monoliths, particularly these details, sort of the 3 different sizes, tombs used more than once, biggest graves being the Neolithic tombs, and the circles in the atmosphere. It's very authentic and very otherworldly.
And so I think as we wrap up here, Nelson, your question about the Moor being true to life. And, we didn't address the Rathbone Bruce Moor. That was on a soundstage.
It was a 300 by 200 foot soundstage.
Right.
In Los Angeles.
There are limits there to what can be replicated. I think the Granada series and the earlier BBC series with Peter Cushing did an admirable job because they were on location, right? So they were actually hitting some of these real-life places that stood in for the locations that Conan Doyle wrote. So from that perspective, those productions were very much more true to life. And I think overall, again, it's this mixture of the fanciful and the realistic that sucks us into this world. And we're going to, I think in a future episode, talk more about the Moor and its role in this story, because it's something that I think is worth pausing on and reflecting on. And we've mentioned it tangentially in the past. We've mentioned it over on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere with a number of people. But there really is something to the Moor that leaps out of the page as a significant contributor to the Hound of the Baskervilles.
Well, I suppose that when we think about this subject, we can say with some satisfaction that there is always more.
And that is no trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
I shall spend, at any rate, a few days upon your moors.